Well, we're ready to get going. Good morning. My name is Kelvin Datcher. I serve as the Director of External Government Affairs for the City of Birmingham under the leadership of Mayor Woodford, and I serve as the chair of the BBA Governmental Affairs Committee, at least for 55 more minutes. We are glad to have you guys here today for a very exciting speaker, someone who means quite a bit to our community. Although he is in one of our neighboring municipalities, he plays a very important role statewide for a critical and crucial issue for the entire state of Alabama. Nan, Darrell, do we have any thoughts or comments before I introduce our great speaker today?
No, Mr. Chairman, let's get started.
Well, folks, from the he missed his, there was no Alabama football this weekend, so State Representative Bill Poole may have tried to come up with something else to do, but he is a graduate of Alabama 2 times, I do believe. Very importantly for us, he serves as the House Ways and Means Education Committee chair down in Montgomery. He has been significantly involved in ensuring that our young people have the resources that they need to be competitive, not only locally, but globally. He talks quite a bit on ensuring that we pursue a world-class quality of education for the children and young people of the state of Alabama. With that, please welcome Representative Bill Poole. Good morning, Mr. Representative.
Good morning, Kelvin, and thank you for having me and for the introduction, and certainly appreciate everybody being on the call today and the opportunity for me to visit with you. I thought I would talk through a couple of issues and make sure I maintain sufficient time to answer any other questions, but I would ask you, Kelvin, or anybody else, please redirect me if I am off the topics that this group would like to discuss. I'd certainly like to, far more interested in talking about what all of you would like to talk about as opposed to me just talking. So, but I thought I would talk about very briefly within the context of my role as Education Budget Chairman, at least the fiscal status of the state, kind of a budget update, so to speak. Kind of just touch quickly on what seems to be the general thought out there is, are we or are we not going to have a special session? Then I want to talk a little bit about this Innovation Commission that I see a number of folks on the call have some involvement with, including myself, to make sure that this group is aware of the work of that commission that I think is very important. And then maybe just a couple closing thoughts as it relates to the next regular session, although I expect it to be anything but regular, so to speak. So with that, I'll begin with kind of the fiscal position of the state, which is, I think I can say in summary, that I think the fiscal position is quite remarkable for Alabama in light of COVID and everything that has occurred in the calendar year 2020 and where we are now and how we look going forward. So as all of you know, Alabama has not fared particularly well in prior economic downturns. And of course, that's inherent in any economic downturn. But certainly as we think back in our most recent experience to the downturn of 08, 09, I mean, that was devastating for our state, like so many others. But it was devastating for our state budgets and our fiscal capacities, particularly in the education sector, but beyond. And just to be candid, we spent many years as a state just trying to get back to zero, quite frankly, from a fiscal standpoint. We met and exceeded that high water mark in recent years. But, we've changed the way we budget for the education appropriations. We budget in much more accurately as it relates to estimates, much more conservatively. And what it really struck me, and I'm not going to get way down in all the details, although I love to do that and I could bore you all with it for hours, but we really changed the way we cash flow the education budget. And I hadn't really thought about it in that context necessarily until COVID hit. But the long and short is Alabama is one of few states that for the fiscal year that just began, when we passed the budgets in the last regular session in the midst of the pandemic's onset, for the fiscal year that just began, obviously we were extremely worried and very concerned. But our estimates told us we still had upside capacity. We budgeted very appropriately, but we increased budgets for both the education budget and the general fund budget for FY21 that we are now in. And our our performance heretofore is exceeding those estimates. And so not only do we pass larger budgets for the state of Alabama, we're expecting now to outperform those projections. And as we prepare to go back into session in early February to think about the next year's fiscal budgets, we're going to be on sound footing. And I think that's remarkable. And I think within the context of our history as a state, but also all the difficult things that we have all had to deal with via COVID, business, personal, and everything else, we haven't had to deal with a lot of that on the state level. We've been stable. And so while other states have cut education spending, cut spending, or trying to figure out how to close budget gaps, we're not in that position in Alabama. We are very stable from a fiscal standpoint. And here again, I think that helps us as we try to work on all, both in the private sector and public arena, as we're trying to solve problems, it's better to have stability. And so I'm very pleased with that. And I think as we enter that next session and we start talking about budgets, as all of you pay attention to that discussion, you're going to sense that kind of theme is recurring, that we're going to be on, provided something doesn't change. And this is still 2020, and it's been one hell of an unpredictable year. But provided we kind of maintain course, we're going to be on solid footing. And that's good for our state. It's good for education. It's good for infrastructure investment, so on and so forth. So as it relates then outside of the budget context necessarily, but to more of the issues of the day, there's obviously been a pretty substantial amount of talk and speculation about some priority issues that we need to address in the state. That are fiscally oriented or jobs or economic development oriented. And do we or don't we need to come back and have a special session before the end of the calendar year? And so I know a lot of you on the call that pay attention to these things closely are very in tune with that. Some of you who don't follow quite as closely still are probably reading and seeing a little bit of that talk. And I can't give you the answer today. I don't have the answer as to whether or not the governor will call the legislature back into a special session. But I'll tell you, I think there's three issues that there seems to be common agreement on generally. And I think that we should go back in and resolve before the end of the calendar year. There are a lot of ancillary issues that come into that equation, but let me talk to the three specifics. One is, the state's really backbone of our economic development incentives, certainly for manufacturing and industrial incentives, is the Alabama Growing and Jobs Act, as we kind of shorthand refer to it. The Growing Alabama Act expired at the end of October. It is the smaller of those two programs, but the lion's share of those two programs, the Jobs Act, expires at the end of the calendar year. You've read about that. I'm not going to get in all the details. But the state would be able to sustain all of its commitments currently, but would not be able to enter into any new commitments as it relates to those economic development incentives post expiration. So as it relates to that issue, can we get back and renew those in this calendar year before the jobs expires? Or will we find ourselves in the spring trying to re-up and renew it, notwithstanding we'll have a dead period, so to speak? And one thing that concerns me is if we wait till February, we get down in the legislature, we have a positive COVID test of a member, then just like in the last session, when we were trying to work on the same issue last spring before, everything ground to a halt, we're going to end up grinding right back to a halt. And so, this notion that we can rush back in and renew them in February, may or may not be a reality if that's the situation we find ourselves in. So that's an important incentive programs. There's a reason that we set these on renewal timelines and what we call sunset them. It's so that we can review these programs and see what's working and what's not, and where can we invest and have greater results? Where do we dial back? How do we adapt and change those? And all of those discussions are part of this issue. This is a critical program for the state, but I don't think anybody thinks it just needs a rubber stamp and let's keep doing it. How do we sharpen it? How do we improve it? How do we reorient it? What does COVID do to economic development incentives? How is the world going to be changed post-COVID? I think there are a lot of issues within that program that need to be discussed and addressed. They are being discussed and addressed, but it's also really hard to have those complex and in-depth and broad-based conversations during the COVID era when nobody can really meet as well. So that's issue number one, potentially for a special, but whether a special or not is, I think, has to be a critical priority for the state. Two is making sure that we let folks know that, the state's not going to tax your federal stimulus, those payments back that the government on an individual basis, at least. It would be important if we're going to do that to let that be known prior to the end of the tax year. Folks start working on their taxes in January. It'd be better, I think, for everybody to know, businesses and individuals, how that's going to work before tax prep starts. So the earlier I think we can enact that and lock that in, the better. Thirdly is the business immunity or liability bill, however folks refer to it, but more or less making sure businesses are protected, not completely immune, but certainly are protected from frivolous lawsuits as it relates to COVID issues. That's an important issue. The legislature was trying to get that one passed when things kind of ground to a halt in the last regular, when we were early in the pandemic. There were a lot of reasons we weren't able to get that across the finish line. A primary one was the inability of the House with 105 members to really function properly through the legislative process with all that chaos, and that one kind of just didn't get across the finish line. So, I think it's critical. Those three are time sensitive, and in my judgment, we should have a special on those and nothing else. Let's get those priorities done, get in and get out. And let our citizens and businesses across the state know that that's been accomplished before Christmas and before the turn of the year. And then the legislature can come back at the beginning of February with those issues taken care of and start to focus on that next set of priorities. And I, for one, think that would be the best course of business. But again, there are a lot of complicating factors in that the governor and legislative leadership and many others are talking about, and I hope are able to resolve favorably. I'm going to pivot now and talk about the Innovation Commission, which I'm extremely excited about and am glad that the governor created the commission. So just to give everybody a little bit of background, the governor established a quote unquote Innovation Commission in the spring. And that commission has now had 3 full commission meetings. And it's broken into 2 subcommittees, one focused on education and corporate, and the other on, I think, finance and infrastructure. But so we've gotten a lot of work done in a short time, but the general mission and scope of that Innovation Commission, and for all of you that live in or are familiar with Birmingham, you've seen, I think I can say on your behalf, you've seen the growth of kind of the innovation, technology, entrepreneurial spirit and sector in Birmingham. And I think that's something, quite frankly, that Birmingham can be extremely proud of and excited about. And that the state with Birmingham can be excited about it. But the charge of the commission, and I think it's the right charge at the right time and for the right reasons, is, how do we grow our entrepreneurial spirit in Alabama? How do we foster startups? How do we foster more technology, more research, more knowledge-based jobs? And I would talk about that in a couple of ways. First, we know we have some assets in Alabama, and we've seen that we can have success in that in Birmingham and other areas. But we've never had a statewide strategy on it, in my opinion. And so what would that strategy look like if we really did identify our assets, also identify our weaknesses, what are our barriers, what are our struggles? There's some really consistent themes there. Get regulatory barriers out of the way. We need more access to capital, talent, all of those things that everybody, when you sit down and think about startups and economic development and growth, those are consistent themes. But can we craft a clear and compelling strategy for the state as a whole to grow that sector. And I think it is personally maybe the most significant economic development opportunity that we have as a state right now. I mean, I think it was significant as technology changes more rapidly and everything becomes more technology based these days. But with all the disruption of COVID that it has caused, to me, it accelerates all of that technological change. It disrupts a lot of things. And within that disruption, I think is opportunity for Alabama if we're smart about it. Companies are going to look to move. Technologies are going to evolve. There's going to be new, the supply chains are going to change. We're going to onshore certain things that we didn't, we've allowed to be manufactured or whatever the case may be elsewhere. Where are our opportunities within that to be successful in Alabama? And recognizing those opportunities too, I think we have a workforce opportunity, and I think it is equally as critical for our state in that, pre-COVID, we were at historically low unemployment levels. So we were as fully employed as the state's ever been historically. And I expect us to get back to that in pretty short order post-COVID personally. So where we had a lot of jobs, we were struggling to find enough people to fill those that were trained and capable and ready. On the other hand, in my judgment, and maybe to drive home this point, I say often, and I say it kind of flippantly to prove the point, in Alabama, we export a lot of timber, we export a lot of chickens, we export a lot of automobiles, and we export a lot of college graduates, far too many. And I think Forbes ranks us third in the country at the worst brain drain percentage. And I think there's probably some drivers of that statistic that probably are kind of skew that a little bit against us, but it doesn't matter. The point remains, over here in these jobs, I think we have a lot of people and a lot of raw talent and a lot of workforce, but we don't have the jobs to keep them in the state. And so I think of it as an economic development and a workforce issue as well. So I think the Innovation Commission's efforts is a big part. It's not the only part of addressing those issues, but I'm really excited about the Innovation Commission. We have an advisory council that's kind of guiding the work of the commission. The commission are the lunch pail people, as I would say it, private sector folks from around the state who are really doing all or most of the work of the commission. And I've been impressed at the work and the ethic and the time folks have contributed. But the advisory council too, we have Dr. Condoleezza Rice, who is now the head person, I'm not sure the title, of Stanford's Hoover Institution, which is the preeminent public policy, institution in the country by most accounts. And I'm excited about some conversations we're having, not just with Dr. Rice, but the Hoover Institution about possible resources. And, maybe I hope we'll have some good news on that front in short order. But, we have a guy named Chris Moody, who is an Auburn graduate from Alabama. I didn't know Chris. He's just a fascinating guy. Lives out in Boulder, Colorado, but sold his business and was one of the early Twitter guys, as I'm sure I'm not saying that exactly right, but he's a fascinating guy and is now doing venture capital. Jared Weinstein in New York City, Bill Smith, who of course everybody knows, but we've got folks both inside and outside of the state working on this with us. And, as I've told some folks, I think it's important too that we've got to brand our state within this context and speak not only to our own citizens and our culture of entrepreneurship and startups and technology and all this, but also brand ourselves outside of the state. And I think the Dr. Rices and the Chris Moody's and the Jared Weinsteins and the Bill Smiths and those, they can really help us. I think they can tell us, guide us on how to do that, but they can also be their ambassadors for us, as they really already have been in many respects. So I think the commission has a lot of potential. It's my expectation that it will produce actionable outcomes and suggestions. As I've told people, I don't have the time, nor do the folks who have participated as commission members have the time to just waste talking and feeling good, we're going to be outcome driven. And so I'm excited about that. The commission's work will not culminate until it's required to submit a report of recommendations in October of 21. So we have about 11 months left, but we're off and running. We've not been able to have, originally we wanted to have meetings all around the state and let folk, make sure people could participate, and COVID certainly put a damper on that. So we're trying to make sure folks know about it and we're getting input from around the state. But certainly would hope all of you that have an interest will monitor those meetings and quite frankly, support and promote entrepreneurships and startups and that whole sector, as I kind of broadly refer to it. Because here again, I think Alabama has an opportunity, but certainly Birmingham has already created its own opportunity, but I think would really benefit if the state really goes in it with both feet too. So I think Birmingham will be central to that and what we can learn from Birmingham and how we can support Birmingham, but also support the whole state. So that's been exciting. And as I say, and some of you would probably agree, I love just talking and quite frankly, listening to the folks that operate in this sector. I wish I could just have a drink and listen to them sometime. They speak a whole different language and it's fascinating to me. But I think it's one of the important opportunities for Alabama. Lastly, just thinking forward to the next session, and maybe try my best I can to foreshadow some issues that I think you'll see a lot of chatter about, but certainly recognizing in these unusual times, it's hard to predict anything at the moment. But certainly the three issues that I outlined as the possible targets of a special session, if not resolved in a special, will be priorities number 1A, and 1C, B, C, you get the point, in a regular. But beyond those, I think you're still going to see the prison issue is still swirling around and needs to be resolved in the state. I think, look, just to say it too, with a new administration coming into DC, that adds pressure, I think, on the state to get something done. We need to get something done. So hopefully we'll see action on the prison issue in whatever form that takes. That's positive for the state. Obviously, I think you're going to see a lot of post-COVID. I don't know that we'll be post-COVID then, but what comes from this pandemic, a lot of folks will have a lot of ideas. Whether that will be the time in the arc of the COVID timeline to address those, I don't know, but we'll see. But I think you'll see a lot of economic development proposals. You'll see a lot of education issues that will be complicated for the state. I worry and start thinking about education again. We always are, but we got some schools that have been in class in person, some that haven't. We've got a lot of federal money. I mean, hundreds of millions kind of moving around the K-12 system when I think they're just had large parts just trying to get through one day at a time. So I think the disruption in education is going to create a lot of problems and confusion. It's going to be hard, I think, on the state level to sort through those. But I hope we're able to, if nothing else, provide stability and guidance and some clarity of vision of where we, I worry we've lost basically a year of education, and that's not knocking anybody in education at all, particularly on K-12. But I mean, nobody can argue it's been a normal year. And I think nobody can argue credibly that there hadn't been an adverse impact on K-12 education particularly. So to what extent, to where, how do we target it? Where are those needs? I think you'll see a lot on that front as well. So I always joke that the regular sessions are never regular, but there won't be anything regular about this one. And I worry about the looming impact, as I don't think COVID will be gone at that point. And so how will the legislature function? Can it function? It will function. Don't misunderstand me, but one very, very important thing, and it is critical in the legislative process, is to be transparent, for the public to be able to see what's going on, and for there to be a lot of communications so that complex issues are worked out through conversation and understanding perspectives. And it's hard to have those conversations and communications right now. I think it'll be hard then. And so how does that impact that process? I worry about that some, but at the end of the day, what matters is outcomes. And we need a process that gets us to good outcomes in Alabama. And we're coming out of a tough time with COVID. So I think it's going to be important to try to keep the stuff out of the way and focus on the outcomes that will help Alabamians. And so certainly hope that's where we end up. So I have blasted through a lot of thoughts and issues. I'm glad. As I joke, I'm both a public official and a lawyer, so I'm like the worst of both worlds. I can talk as long as y'all want me to, but I'll stop and see if there are any specific issues that y'all would like me to look closer at, or other issues that I failed to address.
Well, Mr. Representative, the questions are pouring in, so I guess you weren't too boring because you prompted quite a few inquiries. A couple right off the top: the Growing Alabama Act, the R&D tax credits. Can you talk about those two real quick?
Sure. So, Growing Alabama and R&D credits are two different things. The state has been, we've kind of been a lot of talk and work on R&D tax credits. What's the appropriate scope and role for those? What do you target? I mean, one thing that's been important for me is to say, if we're going to give a tax credit for R&D, it needs to be new R&D. We need to incentivize new activity, not give tax credits for things that are already occurring. So how do you do that? How do you distinguish between those two? So I think the R&D credit remains out there to the extent that I've articulated to all of you how important I think research and technology and innovation and entrepreneurship. I mean, I think all of that goes hand in hand to some extent. It's the same sphere of issues as R&D that I think are critical for Alabama. But how do you craft those? I don't think we've quite put our finger on that button just yet. And how does that piece of the puzzle fit with all the other pieces? And I think that's always a struggle of, how does this fit with that? We got to get growing done. What does that mean for R&D? So on and so forth. So I hope I've answered that somewhat.
Yes, sir. What about the Alabama Jobs Act?
Well, the Jobs Act, I mean, it's going to get renewed, in my opinion. I think the only question is when and, what changes are made to it. And I don't expect big changes to it, but, how long will it be extended? Will we direct more funding to it or keep it at current levels? How are we targeting and making sure rural areas enjoy some benefit from that? Look, 25 counties have not received any projects via the Growing Jobs Act. So what does that mean? That doesn't mean those incentives aren't good incentives, but it does mean there's a gap. So does that gap need to be filled via the Growing Jobs Act, or does it need to be filled via something else? I think it's probably something else, but you got to think through those things in the renewal process. And so minority businesses, how do we make sure that minority-owned businesses have an opportunity to participate? These are generally big industrial type of incentives, and we amended it 2 or 3 years ago. I carried the AIM Act in the House, the Alabama Incentives Modernization Act, which tried to kind of, I think really, frankly, it was a drop in the bucket, but it tried to recognize that we do also need to make sure these incentives can work in rural areas with smaller jobs thresholds, or in the technology sector with smaller jobs thresholds. And so I think those are the kind of the theme of the conversations that are ongoing as we get to the point that they're going to be renewed, because they need to be renewed.
Do you know if the state's on track to spend its CARES Act allocation by the end of the year? If not, I can get you a deposit slip from our finance director for the city of Birmingham. But do you have any idea? Do you guys get updates about that?
Now that's a good question, and obviously it's a hot topic. I mean, the problem that Alabama has dealt and continues to face is not that they're not needs or there's not a desire to get the funds to those needs. The real dilemma has been the Treasury regulations are very restrictive as to what the CARES Act funds can be utilized for. So we've had lots of applications come into the state, but they don't meet the CARES Act guidelines. And so they're not eligible for use. So, Alabama and basically every other state, possibly every single one, unless those guidelines are loosened, will send some money back to the feds at the end of the calendar year. Now, there's talk about extending the deadline from the calendar year, which I think would be good. There's some talk right now trying to shift some funds around with the deadline looming to just do everything we can to use every dollar that we can. A lot of funds have been allocated, but just haven't been spent yet. That's different than they haven't been allocated and they can't be spent. So when you read about it, distinguish those two. Those are very different. But the eligibility restrictions are real and they're pretty substantial, and it is a struggle for Alabama. And if you Google around other states or go to the NCSL, National Conference of State Legislatures, you will see really no state is able to fully expend those dollars under the current eligibility criteria.
One little plug for municipalities, Mr. Representative. I know that a lot of talk around the country is about the Treasury guidelines that change that allow for public safety payroll and benefits to be reimbursed. So if you have the ear of anybody down there, I'm sure all my brethren and sisters in municipalities would love to see us be able to access maybe more of those dollars for public safety reimbursement. Commissioner Ammons asked, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, I think that's a good point. And I'll make one other good point, or I'll make a point. Y'all may think it's a good point or not. We put a big chunk in the unemployment fund, and that may well happen again. But to explain to everybody, when you do, if we don't replenish the unemployment fund that was depleted based on all the claims, then all the businesses in Alabama will have to pay more into the fund, almost a tax to replenish. So too, there's been confusion about, does that mean we're doing X, Y, or Z? No, by replenishing that fund with these CARES Act monies, we're protecting and insulating business from increased unemployment premiums. So I think that's a pro-business thing. Now, we could argue about 100 different uses for the money, and we can, but you might see that again as well.
We did receive a question from our good friend, County Commissioner Steve Ammons. He asked about the state historic tax credits.
Yeah, those are, they're not up for review this year. They will come back up for review. I'm not sure the timeline, but I think that they will remain intact as they are unless and until either the sunset review period runs and we'll have to renew, or unless there's an effort to increase the caps. Now, I recall a few years ago, I think we filled up the credit claims pretty early and came back and increased the cap so that we could fund more. So, but I haven't heard much about the historic tax credit lately. But I think it would come back to the forefront if all the funds have been expended and there needs to be a cap increase, or when the sunset period runs, and it does not run in this current year. It may be looming on the not distant horizon, but I don't think it's upon us now.
I was asked, do you expect us to be tapping into the rolling reserve education tax fund?
So, the Rolling Reserve Act is really what authorizes and helps us manage our cash flow in the education budget. And by virtue of that, it has created a rainy day fund. And we have incrementally on a yearly basis devoted funds to that rainy day account. And I think we're up to just under 400 million now. And so I think when folks refer to the Rolling Reserve Fund, I presume we're talking about really that rainy day fund only under the Rolling Reserve Act. We did use that a few months ago during the pandemic to really kind of bridge loan the state. It's been paid back. So those funds are now back in the rainy day account. It was a really nice tool in the middle of a pandemic to cover some financial obligations, but it has been repaid. At this point, we have no reason to foresee cutting education spending or proration. And unless and until that would be the case, there would be no reason to withdraw funds from that rainy day account, and that would not be authorized by law.
You talked a lot about innovation, and I've heard you talk about innovation not just in terms of technology, but just in terms of doing things differently, right? Are there any specific strategies or initiatives, particularly in education, that have caught your eye, that you've thought about, that you think we should really consider at a state level?
Well, I mean, so yes, there are, and I'll mention one or two realities that I think we face that we don't think about when we talk about education. But I will say too, though, that our schools are just, I mean, they're in chaos right now, and I think our leaders on the local level are doing the best they can, by and large, under very difficult circumstances. And as long as we're in this disruptive period, I'd be very hesitant to throw a bunch of changes on K-12s right now when I think they're really just trying to survive and sustain and teach under trying circumstances. But now, having said that, let me pivot and say one thing. We've got to improve education outcomes in Alabama. I don't think anybody disagrees with that or disputes that. And I think a lot of things we need to do that we're not doing and we need to improve on. But, it's all going to start with early grade literacy and math. And if we don't get there, we're not going to get anywhere. If we don't have kids reading and doing arithmetic at proficiency level at the third grade, we're just not going to achieve the outcomes that we want in the out years. And having said that, we have an acute teacher shortage in Alabama, primarily in the STEM fields, math and science and so on. That's not unique to Alabama. We're not alone in that. That's a nationwide trend, but it is a very acute problem for us. We can talk all day long about getting our math scores up, but if we don't have certified math teachers in the classrooms, we're not going to be successful. So I think we've got to really recognize we have an acute shortage of math and science teachers. What are we going to do about that? And I think there's some ideas that are on the table. I've got an idea I'm getting ready to put on the table, but sometimes I think we lose sight when we're trying to all do the right thing and improve education outcomes. We kind of lose sight of a few of those fundamentals. Like the amount of classrooms in this state, math and science, that are being taught by teachers that are not certified in that subject is staggering. And I, for one, hope we focus on early grades and on teacher shortage and on quality teachers the best we can. And I think results will follow. Now, there's a lot of other things that we need to be doing better than we're doing, and that we're not doing at all in some cases. And we've got to constantly challenge ourselves. And I would say in education, we cannot fear change. When you talk about changing education, it's controversial. People go to their corners, but we've got to embrace some innovation. I think maybe COVID will present some opportunities in education, but we have got to be willing to innovate and embrace change in education and try to do some things differently if we want better outcomes.
Last one, do you expect to see lobbyists and the public being able to have access to the state legislature during the session?
Yeah, I mean, obviously with cases now spiking, who knows what happens next week or next month or the next month, but I know that it's important for legislators for the building to be open to the public. Now, does that mean it's going to be open in the same way that it's been before? I don't know. What does that mean for the general public versus lobbyists? I don't know. Those conversations are ongoing, but what you don't want, obviously, is for the legislature to go in the building and the front doors to be locked. That's really not the way it's supposed to work. And that was a problem at the end of the last regular. It causes breakdowns of communication. It causes breakdowns of transparency. I don't think it leads to the best outcomes. So I think there will be every effort to be as transparent and open to the public as possible. But will that be in the same way in this February as it has been in prior years? And traditionally, it's hard to imagine it'll be quite the same.
Well, Mr. Representative, I'll tell you this. I've been chairing this all year, and and please don't take this wrong, but this is the meatiest, nerdiest conversation that we've had, and it's been one of my favorites. This is awesome, man. I hope to catch you offline. I need, Greg Jones or Darryl Perkins, somebody, I need y'all to line up this lunch for me. This was phenomenal. We really appreciate your time and particularly answering all these really in-depth taxing questions that we had today.
Well, I appreciate it. And anytime y'all would like to have me back, I'm glad to join. And I can get as way down in the weeds as y'all want to. And I think sometimes I get too far down there. But certainly, I'm glad to join this group. I appreciate everybody that is on here that cares and thinks about Alabama and how we can do things better. And so as I said at the beginning, I'll say again too, anytime any of you have an idea or a criticism or anything, it's not going to hurt my feelings. So I don't have all the answers and never said I did. So anytime I can be of benefit to this group, I'm glad to do it.
Well, I literally, I can't thank you enough. And it was great not to get slogans, but to get really detailed information from you. And it really shows how much you pour of yourself into the work. And so on behalf of the BBA Government Affairs Committee, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Kelvin. I appreciate it. Good to see all of you today. Hope you
yes,
all
sir.
stay well.
Thank you, Mr. Representative. Fred, you're back with us. We'll turn it over to you.
All right, and Representative Poole, let me add my thanks to you for joining to us and for my sliding you with the S word earlier before we started the Zoom call, or at the start of the Zoom call. We are most fortunate in our state for having Bill Poole in a position of service to it. And thank you for what you do for our state and for coming on and sharing all the detail that you did today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. I appreciate it very much.
Sir. And on a final note, so I want to give a sincere thanks to Kelvin Datcher, who has served as our chairman of the Government Affairs Committee during probably the most tumultuous year of public policy and every other type of policy and issue known to man that happened within and without of the BBA. You've been a mainstay throughout this year. And I want to tell you, we really appreciate your service to the BBA, your service to the city of Birmingham, and to our state, Kelvin. We really thank you. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Thank you guys for creating a forum, man, and keeping it going. It's great for those of us who do this work to have a chance to connect with each other.
Yes, sir. Well, that's what I wanted to say. So thank you again.